The Great War was supposed to be the war to end all wars. It was not. It left behind a scar across the face of the world. In Germany, brought to its knees by the Treaty of Versailles, people felt deep humiliation, saddled with crippling reparations, their military dismantled, their pride shattered. In that fertile ground, a dark ideology took root. A failed artist turned charismatic speaker, Adolf Hitler, rose from obscurity. He promised to restore Germany. He spoke of a master race. He promised a 1,000-year Reich. A desperate people listened. In the Far East, Japan stirred with imperial ambition. An island nation lacking resources eyed mainland Asia, especially China. Military leaders took control. They sought to dominate the Pacific. They aimed to build a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. The invasion of Manchuria in 1931 was an early tremor. The League of Nations condemned it and failed to act. Meanwhile in Italy, Mussolini and his fascists promised Roman greatness. Blackshirts marched on Rome. Mussolini established a dictatorship. In 1935, he invaded Ethiopia. Another act the powers did not stop. Rome and Berlin moved closer, an axis forming. The 1930s became a decade of appeasement. Britain and France tried to avoid another war. They watched Hitler rearm Germany. They watched him march into the Rhineland. They watched him annex Austria. At Munich in 1938, they ceded part of Czechoslovakia for a promise of peace. It was a false peace. The storm clouds only grew darker and more ominous. The world held its breath, waiting for the lightning strike. The war, when it finally came, divided the globe into two great armed camps. On one side stood the Axis powers, a coalition bound by pacts of steel and a shared desire for conquest and dominion. At its heart was Nazi Germany, driven by Hitler's vision of Lebensraum. This was a brutal vision that required the subjugation and extermination of entire populations to the east. Germany's military, the Wehrmacht, had been rebuilt, pioneering tactics that emphasized speed and overwhelming power. They were ready to unleash a new kind of warfare upon an unsuspecting Europe. On September 1, 1939, the world awoke to the sound of thunder. German forces poured across the border into Poland, and the storm had finally broken. This was not the static trench warfare of the last war. This was blitzkrieg, or lightning war, a terrifying symphony of violence, a coordinated assault of dive bombers, panzer tanks, motorized infantry. The Stuka dive bombers with their wailing sirens acted as flying artillery. The tanks punched through defensive lines, encircling entire armies while infantry followed close behind to mop up resistance. The Polish army, brave but outmatched, fought valiantly with cavalry against tanks, but they were crushed in a matter of weeks. With Poland subdued, a strange quiet fell over Western Europe. It was called the Phony War. British and French troops manned their defenses, waiting for an attack that did not come. Then in the spring, the lightning struck again. Germany invaded Denmark and Norway shortly after. On May 10, 1940, Hitler unleashed his main assault, not against the heavily fortified Maginot Line, but through the dense Ardennes forest, a route the Allies had considered impassable for a large armored force. It was a brilliant, audacious gamble that paid off completely. The German panzers burst out of the forest, racing for the English Channel and cutting the Allied armies in two. The British Expeditionary Force and French soldiers were trapped, their backs to the sea, at a port town called Dunkirk. In one of the most remarkable moments of the war, a flotilla of naval vessels, fishing trawlers, yachts, and ferries crossed the channel under constant air attack to rescue the stranded men. Over 338,000 soldiers were evacuated in what became known as the Miracle of Dunkirk. But it was a rescue, not a victory. France, its army shattered and its government in chaos, surrendered soon after. Hitler now stood as the master of continental Europe. Only Great Britain remained. Hitler expected the British to sue for peace, but he underestimated their resolve. To prepare for a planned invasion, codenamed Operation Sea Lion, he first had to gain control of the skies. The Battle of Britain began in the summer of 1940. Against all odds, the few held on. In June 1941, 6 months before Pearl Harbor, Hitler made his most fateful decision. He broke his non-aggression pact with Joseph Stalin and launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. It was honestly the largest military invasion in human history, involving over 3 million Axis soldiers who surged across a front that stretched for thousands of miles. Hitler believed the communist state was a rotten structure that would collapse with a single kick. He sought Lebensraum for Germany and the destruction of his ideological arch-nemesis. For him, this was not just a war of conquest. It was a war of annihilation between Nazism and communism. Initially, the blitzkrieg tactics that had conquered Western Europe worked with devastating efficiency. German panzer divisions knifed deep into Soviet territory, encircling and destroying entire Red Army formations. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were captured in the opening weeks. The Luftwaffe destroyed the Soviet Air Force, much of it on the ground. The German army advanced relentlessly, capturing vast swaths of land, reaching the outskirts of Leningrad and Moscow by the autumn. Victory seemed within Hitler's grasp, but he had underestimated two of Russia's most powerful allies, its vast size and its brutal winter. As the German advance slowed, the Russian winter, known as General Winter, arrived with a vengeance. Temperatures plummeted to levels the German soldiers were not equipped to handle. Engines froze, lubricants turned solid, and soldiers suffered from frostbite and exposure. The long supply lines became stretched to the breaking point. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union, despite its catastrophic losses, refused to collapse. Under Stalin's iron-fisted rule, factories were dismantled and moved east of the Ural Mountains, beyond the reach of German bombers, where they began producing tanks and planes at a prodigious rate. A scorched earth policy ensured that the advancing Germans found little to sustain them. The turning point on the Eastern Front came at the city of Stalingrad in the winter of 1942-43. The battle for the city, which bore Stalin's name, became a brutal, grinding meat grinder. Soldiers fought for every street, every building, every room, in savage close-quarters combat. Hitler became obsessed with taking the city, forbidding his Sixth Army from retreating even as they were encircled by a massive Soviet counteroffensive. Trapped, starving and freezing, the remnants of the German army finally surrendered in February 1943. It was a catastrophic defeat for Germany, from which it would never fully recover. The tide had turned. From Stalingrad onward, the Red Army would be on the offensive, pushing the Germans inexorably back toward Berlin. The war was not just fought by soldiers on distant battlefields, it was a total war, a conflict that reached into every city, every town, every home, fundamentally changing the lives of ordinary people around the world. By the middle of 1942, the Axis powers had reached the high watermark of their conquests. Germany controlled most of Europe and had driven deep into the Soviet Union. Japan dominated the Pacific and Southeast Asia. The Allies were on the defensive everywhere, struggling to hold the line. But in a series of decisive battles fought across the globe, the momentum of the war began to shift. These were the turning points, the moments where the tide began to recede. In the Pacific, the turning point came just 6 months after Pearl Harbor, at a tiny coral atoll called Midway. The Japanese Navy, confident after a string of victories, planned to lure the remaining American carriers into a trap and destroy them. But American codebreakers had partially broken the Japanese naval codes. U.S. Admiral Chester Nimitz knew the enemy's plan. In a battle fought entirely by aircraft, American dive bombers, arriving at the perfect moment, found the Japanese carriers vulnerable as they were rearming their planes. In the space of 5 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers were turned into blazing wrecks. A 4th was sunk later. Japan lost its best naval pilots and its 4 finest aircraft carriers, a blow from which their navy would never recover. At the same time, on the other side of the world, in the barren deserts of North Africa, the British Eighth Army, under General Bernard Montgomery, confronted General Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps at El Alamein in Egypt. A victory for Rommel would have given the Axis control of the Suez Canal, cutting Britain's lifeline to its empire and opening a path to the oil fields of the Middle East. After weeks of brutal attritional fighting, Montgomery's forces, superior in numbers and equipment, finally broke through Rommel's lines. It was the first major land victory for the British in the war. As Churchill famously said, "It is not the end, it is not even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning." These victories at Midway and El Alamein, followed by the catastrophic German defeat at Stalingrad a few months later, fundamentally altered the strategic landscape of the war. The Axis powers lost the initiative and were forced onto the defensive. The Allies, bolstered by the immense industrial production of the United States, were now on the attack. By 1944, the Allies were ready to open the long-awaited Second Front in Western Europe. The plan, codenamed Operation Overlord, was the most complex amphibious invasion ever attempted in history. It involved years of planning, massive deception campaigns, and the assembly of an enormous force. The target was Normandy, a stretch of coastline in northern France. In the pre-dawn hours of June 6, 1944, D-Day, the invasion began. Paratroopers from the American 82nd and 101st Airborne and the British 6th Airborne dropped behind enemy lines, securing key bridges and crossroads, sowing chaos in the darkness. As dawn broke, the largest armada in history appeared off the French coast, nearly 7,000 vessels carrying over 150,000 men. Under a covering bombardment from warships and a massive air umbrella, the troops began to hit the beaches, designated with code names: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. On Omaha Beach, the American forces ran into a buzzsaw of German machine gun fire, artillery, and mortars. The initial waves were pinned down on the sand, suffering horrific losses. But through acts of incredible bravery and leadership, small groups of men began to break through the German defenses, slowly and painfully gaining a foothold on the bluffs above. By the end of this longest day, the Allies were ashore. They had breached Hitler's Atlantic Wall. After brutal fighting in the hedgerow country, the Allies broke out and began a rapid advance across France. On August 25, 1944, Paris was liberated. The end of the war was now in sight. With the Red Army advancing from the east and the Western Allies pushing from the west, the Third Reich was caught in a giant vice, being squeezed from both sides. As 1945 began, the final act of the war in Europe was playing out. The Allies crossed the Rhine River, and the Soviet Red Army closed in on Berlin in a final brutal offensive. The Third Reich, meant to last 1,000 years, was collapsing into rubble after just 12. On April 30, 1945, Adolf Hitler committed suicide. A week later, Germany surrendered unconditionally. Victory in Europe, VE Day, was declared, but the war was not over. In the Pacific, President Truman decided to use a new and terrifying weapon. On August 6, 1945, the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. 3 days later, a second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. On August 15th, Japan announced its surrender. World War II was over. The war left the world shattered and transformed. An estimated 60 million people were dead. The world struggled to build a new order from the ashes. The United Nations was formed, but a new conflict began as the United States and Soviet Union became rivals. A new Iron Curtain descended across Europe, dividing the world once more and beginning the long, tense standoff known as the Cold War.